Welcome, everyone, to this John Berkelund lecture, Seeing, Sensing, Feeling, Sexual Subjects, Precarious Lives, by Juana María Rodríguez, who is the fall 2021 John Berkelund Fellow in the Humanities here at the American Academy. And she's also the chair of Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. As many of you know, the late John P. Berkelund was a dedicated supporter of many educational and cultural institutions, including the American Academy. And here he was a longtime member of our Board of Trustees and endowed the fellowship in his name about a decade ago. Born in Chicago, he graduated from Princeton University and served as U.S. Naval Intelligence Officer in Berlin from 1953 to 1956. After returning to the United States, he built a long and successful career as an investor. But John Berkelund was also an accomplished historian who was especially interested in the interplay of history, policy, and culture. He authored a biography of Gustav Stresemann, Chancellor and Foreign Minister during the Weimar Republic. And he was an elected fellow of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was that rare combination of a talented business leader, vigorous intellectual, and passionate philanthropist whose legacy will certainly live on long after his passing in May 2019. In keeping with his interdisciplinary spirit, Juana María Rodríguez, too, is an exceptionally multifaceted scholar. At Berkeley, she is not only professor of ethnic studies and core faculty in performance studies, but she's also affiliated with a designated emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality, the designated emphasis in critical theory, the Center for Latin American Studies, the Center for Race and Gender, the Berkeley Center for New Media, the Center for the Study of Sexual Culture, and the Haas Institute for a Fair and Equitable Society. And on top of all that, she is one of the warmest, most gracious, and all-around wonderful people you could ever hope to meet. Tonight, Juana will consider different genres of biographical representation through the lens of the life of San Francisco Latina transgender activist Adela Vázquez. Before we begin, it is my great pleasure to reveal a very special guest who can't be here in person tonight, but who will say a few words about Juana via a video message. And I'm specifically saying reveal because Judith Butler needs no introduction. And it is indeed a seriously daunting task to describe them and their accomplishments in any sort of a concise manner. So I decided not to do that. But I should mention that they were also a graduate mentor, a university colleague, and a Berkeley neighbor to Juana. And this is, so to speak, their American Academy connection #1. And here is #2. Judith Butler was also among the American Academy's very first distinguished visitors back in 2001, when they delivered a lecture that examined the idea of kinship as it relates to various arguments for and against gay marriage and adoption. Professor Butler, you don't see her yet, thank you so much for your generous contribution tonight. We hope to have the great pleasure to welcome you very, very soon at the American Academy again. Before we play the video, I just have to say a few words about the procedure of the evening. After Juana's presentation, we will have a Q&A featuring Juana's fellow, Amy Kurzweil, who has graciously agreed to moderate the session. Amy, as many of you know, is a writer and cartoonist whose graphic memoirs explore her family history. And if you missed her lecture, we can, of course, not forgive you, but you have the chance to make up for that. You can go to our website and watch it online. I promise you will not regret it. Now, for those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you should see a Q&A icon below the screen where you can click and submit your questions anytime you want, any questions you would like to ask, and we will do our best to get to all of your questions. I will stop here and let's see the video.
Hi, I'm Judith Butler and I'm recording in Berkeley, California. It's my pleasure today to introduce Juana María Rodríguez, who will give her lecture at the American Academy in Berlin this evening. Juana Rodríguez is one of the most important feminist and queer studies scholars of our time, focusing on queer Latinidad, the intersections among feminism, queer theory, performance, photography, law, social regulation, sexuality studies, race, and gender. At the University of California at Berkeley, she's also the chair of ethnic studies on leave and has served on a wide range of committees. I mention this because she brings the same intensity to her scholarship, teaching, and mentoring that she brings to her service, not only to the university, but to the several publics that the university is meant to serve. As a scholar, her work has shifted the paradigm in U.S. queer and cultural studies, and in recent years, she has become a force, bridging work in Latin America, Spain, and North America that focuses on Latinx sexuality studies. Her first book, Queer Latinidad, was published in 2003. It has become no less than a foundational work in queer Latin American studies. Her second book, Sexual Futures, Queer Gestures, and Other Latina Longings, garnered widespread praise and recognition quickly upon publication. It's rare to see a scholar as eager to affirm cultural complexity as political commitment, but Juana Rodríguez performs those dual tasks exceedingly well. She discerns certain ideological tensions in the movement of narrative, the stories we tell about each other, the stories that are told about us. She brings together literary and social analysis in new ways. She also considers the way that social regulations of sexuality and gender, in particular, institute subject categories that work too often to efface the complexity of lived experience. Even as she finds, even within those scenes of effacement, possibilities for affirming life and desire. No matter what her topic, she provides multi-layered narratives and works in whatever media is available to her to provide an understanding of the intersectional dimensions of the subject through an unsettling constellation of perspectives. Sexual Futures, for instance, stages a new interdisciplinary approach to performance, politics, and law. Indeed, in that quite persuasive work, she shows how embodied forms of resistance take a theatrical form and engage directly with public policy, law, and dominant concepts of political sovereignty. Juana Rodríguez works in an amazingly creative way with various media in order to show the relationship between subject formation and aesthetic possibilities. She also shows how self-stylization is less a deflection from politics than an engaged commentary on our political world. She further shows how non-narrative forms of self-representation are crucial to understanding a way of life, even though they can never be a way of telling a story about one's life. Her most recent work on photography makes the point graphically and in a vivid way. Indeed, in that work, she effectively rewrites the theory of autobiography in light of political struggles and forms of self-representation that are hybrid, improvised, moving across media and genre, amplifying ways of loving and working for which there are no ready sociological categories. When Juana Rodríguez speaks about performance, she's not only talking about burlesque and drag, although sometimes she's doing precisely that, but also the embodied enactment of policy and law. In addition to nuanced analyses of deliberately queer performances, she offers deft considerations of sodomy laws and sovereignty struggles, all of which involve embodied enactments that navigate the distance between law and its performance. She focuses on the interruptive potential of certain performances, showing how embodied gesture and radical political project can and do work together to contest dominant racial imaginaries and to produce new horizons of possibility. As much as she makes the case for the political consequences of performance, she underscores the broad theoretical reach of performance studies as well. Juana Rodríguez has recently completed a book that relies on photographic archives of sex workers in Mexico from the last century, Puta, Seeing Latinas Working Sex. This work, to be published by Duke University Press, considers the range of biographical, autobiographical representations that make historically marginal subjects knowable to those who seek to reconstruct their lives through various archives. She considers the polytemporal problem opened up by using both photography and biography as modes of access to the past of another person's life. She also considers the relationship between aging and racialized sexuality, themes that are not considered enough in sexuality studies. This new work is beautifully crafted, and it focuses on the illustrated life histories of sex workers, focusing on what the presentation of the face can offer as a way of soliciting recognition and establishing lived historical realities. Indeed, this impressive work contributes to new theories of photography, life story, image and narrative, the archive, and the cultural history of Latina sex workers. At issue is not only how photos and stories may produce a testimony to a life on the margins, but how that testimony works against a political tendency to efface or degrade the lives of sex workers. Her work is committed to understanding better how dignity can be found and affirmed among lives on the margin. And in this way, she brings heart into everything she does, as she expands understanding and the capacity for work and love, for life and sorrow, and for those pleasures that emerge precisely when life is hardest. I'm sorry not to be there, but so pleased and honored to introduce Juana María, a singular force.
And here she is. Thank you so much.
Trying to. Got it. Okay. Wow. I'm going to do my very best to. It's impossible to live up to that introduction, but I'll try. I want to begin by thank Judith again for that overly generous introduction. I want to thank Berit for her warmth and her wit and her friendship. I want to thank all of the outstanding staff at the American Academy in Berlin and the many generous donors who support the Academy. All have contributed to making my stay here both productive and restorative. Finally, I want to thank my fellow fellows who have kept it lively, entertaining, thoroughly stimulating. You have all helped make this a truly memorable experience. My presentation today emerges from my new book project, Puta Life, Seeing Latinas Working Sex. This new book is organized around the image of la puta, the whore, the perennial figure of Latinized feminine sexual excess. Today, I'm going to present a brief overview of that project and give you a small taste of some of the extraordinary images that I've been working with before diving into what will be the last chapter of that book. In that book, I begin by considering an 1864 archive to talk about visuality in the state's historical investments in the biopolitical control of sexual labor. That book, shown here, Registro de Mujeres Públicas, emerged as a result of a new legislation imposed by Maximilian I during the brief period in which he served as Emperor of Mexico. That law required sex workers to register with the state and have their photographs taken in a moment when both photography and state protocols around sexual regulation were just beginning to emerge. I then turned to a range of iconic European and American photographers to trace the aesthetic motifs about race and gender that coalesced to produce a visual representation of puta life. There, I exposed the ways visual availability becomes sutured to sexual availability. Going further, I argue that these photographers invite us to look for sexual deviance, and importantly, they train us how to identify it. The book then offers 3 extended case studies that combine biography with forms of visual documentation. The first examines the larger-than-life figure of porn star legend Vanessa del Rio and her as-told-to memoir, 50 Years of Slightly Slutty Behavior. This book, a massive tome, comes complete with a DVD and mixes elements of autobiography, documentary, and pornography to unsettle assumptions about puta life, as well as the interpretive practices we might bring to them. From there, I returned to Mexico City to consider a range of texts that document Casa Xochiquetzal, a unique home for elderly sex workers, some retired, most not, to examine the affective impact of different forms of documentation. I focus on 2 books. The first, seen here, is a 6-year collaboration between a French photographer and a Mexican journalist, and emerges as a photojournalistic account of the house. The second, The Women of Casa X, by British photographer Malcolm Venville, presents formal portraits, including nude portraits of many of the same women, alongside brief biographical accounts to produce a very different kind of affective response. That house has also inspired a series of documentaries that provide moving accounts of these women's lives, even as all of these texts recount the everyday misogyny, social stigma, and state neglect that permeate this archive. They also call upon different affective registers to make us see and to make us care. Let me turn now to the subject of tonight's presentation. Like the other case studies in this book, what I'm presenting today is about a person and an idea. The idea is that we might be able to tell stories about ourselves or about other people in ways that convey something real and meaningful. This is the idea, or perhaps the story, that we would like to believe, that representation is possible, that if we try hard enough, if we choose our words carefully, that they will carry our desire for recognition and repair, for connection, human and otherwise, across the vast expanses between us. But perhaps we have come to realize that the stories that we perform move in social and material worlds where other fictions and feelings also roam. No matter how hard we try, we are always being misunderstood, misrecognized, misinterpreted. Our stories are never fully our own. The languages we speak, the bodies we inhabit, and the spaces we travel have been produced by everything that has preceded us, even as the fresh moment of the now works to make them original again and again. In their eloquent introduction to a special issue of Women in Performance Studies, Joshua Guzman and Cristina Leon offer us lingering as a methodological mode of engagement. They write, lingering as a verb demands a kind of languor, a dwelling that inhabits the spaces of ambivalence and ambiguity. lingering becomes a critical practice in meditating upon the possibilities of an impasse. For this presentation, I ask that you indulge me in this desire to linger, to sit with the feminine feelings of opening for and with another, to linger in the impasse between seeing and sensing. I want to tell you a story about a person, Adela Vasquez, a real person with a scent and a style and an amazing past. Because even if we know that stories are mediated and constructed, we know stories do things in the world. Through the promise of imagination, stories create new conditions of being. They ignite memories that are not uniquely our own, and they have the power to activate novel ways of seeing the worlds around us. In his introduction to Sexilio, a graphic biography about Adela's life, Jaime Cortés writes, "The life of Adela Vasquez is everything, transnational, transgendered, transformative, and truly transfixing." Sexilio narrates Adela's journey of being assigned male at birth in Cuba, forming part of the Mariel boat lift, working as a sex worker and later as a sexual health educator and advocate in San Francisco. Along the way, Adela shares her unique insights about life, sex, community, and care. As is the case for most people, Vasquez worked as a sex worker only briefly, although, as her narrative makes clear, she's been working sex all her life. Published in 2004, as the United States was on the cusp of being home to over 1 million people living with HIV and AIDS, Sexile Sexilio was imagined as an HIV prevention project, funded through the Institute for Gay Men's Health and AIDS Project Los Angeles. Published as a slim paperback, printed in English on one side and Spanish on the other, the paper volume was initially made available for free while copies lasted, and for years later as a free digital download. In his introduction, Hebert writes, "HIV prevention is too often preoccupied with tiny pieces of what we do, rather than the fullness of what we feel and the vastness of who we are becoming. Sexile is special because it reminds us of the power of storytelling," end quote. Those words were written in the days before PrEP and the medical management of HIV and AIDS, when stories, valued as medicine, were still being funded. It should be noted that Pato Hebert, Jaime Cortés, and Adela Vázquez are all part of what Hebert calls the diasporic folk of Proyecto Village, a reference to Proyecto Contra SIDA por Vida, Project Against AIDS for Life, a Latinx HIV prevention agency founded in 1993, where I first met Adela, Jaime, Pato, and so many others. Here, the intimacy and friendship that the text performs is one that is shared by the subject, narrator, and critic, all of us bound together in a kind of queer kinship through our shared work with Proyecto. And for my W.E.B. Du Bois lecture at Humboldt University next Tuesday, I'll be presenting work about Proyecto. Like many of the other personal narratives I have assembled in this book, Adela's story is narrated in the familiar as told to style, mediated through the creative and editorial vision of someone else who has been entrusted to translate oral speech into a published format. However, in this case, that process also involved shaping someone's words and memories into pictorial renderings, handcrafted visual depictions that attempt to reproduce the events of a lifespan, embodying what cartoonist and my fellow Amy Kurzweil describes as the intimacy of the hand-drawn line. In the introduction, Jaime Cortés, himself a queer Chicano and Adela's friend, describes his own insecurity as an illustrator, writer, and researcher, and narrates his own investment in the story. He writes, When the fear and uncertainty came a-knockin', I turned back to the transcripts of my interviews with Adela to remind myself why I need this story to be in the world. Not just because I'm a queer, child of immigrants, or a lover of both comics and sexual narratives, but because this story is so fucked up, fabulous, raggedy, and human that it opens a vast space where we can all ponder our own sense of risk, exile, and home. Cortés sees his labor not as a work of altruism designed to promote the human rights of others, but as part of his desire, his need to create a capacious space for imagining his own life. And I should add that, like the other biographical accounts that comprise my book project, Adela's life story is vital to my own desire for narratives that depict the risks and pleasures of living a sexual life out loud. In Sexilio, Adela's story begins, not to brag, but my birth was revolutionary. Adela was born in Camagüey, Cuba in 1958, in a rural interior province on the eve of the Cuban Revolution. Sexuality is lived differently in the countryside. It is seen and sensed through nature. And like the autobiography of famed gay Cuban author Reinaldo Arenas, Adela describes scenes of erotic intimacies with the flora and fauna that shaped her childhood. She states, I was fascinated by farm sex, cow sex, chicken sex, insect sex. And then she proceeds to describe how she used to fuck this one banana tree. On the next page, we get this. And the top says, the tree got boring, and I graduated to humans. I used farm temptations to get sex. And the panels below describe how the young Adela would lure her schoolmates to the barn with the promise of sex with a goat, and then offer herself in exchange. You want to put your thing in me instead? Now, these stories of banana trees, farm temptations, and 9-year-olds having penetrative sex might seem spectacular and foreign, and perhaps even a little horrifying to some. But what is immediately clear is that none of that is how it appears to Adela. This is her story of childhood sexuality, her terms of narrative engagement. Farther down we get, 9 years old and I was pimping a goat to get laid. And you know what? The goat wasn't even that cute if you really look at the bitch. Ooh, child, I was such a manipulating liar, but I couldn't help it, because even then I would do anything for the sex. Besides, it was great revenge. Now, how getting fucked by a boy who thought he was coming to fuck a goat is about getting revenge? Well, that's not really spelled out. It should already be clear that Adela is rarely invested in how we might read her story, what sense or nonsense we might make of the stories she tells. But perhaps, if we linger on this passage, we can imagine the ways the boys might have treated the 9-year-old who grew up to be Adela, and conjure why she might want to exact revenge in this moment of her childhood, or in this recitation of this scene of youthful sexuality years later. In the bottom panel, Cortés allows us to visually step outside of the time of the story and returns us to the time of the present to depict the orality upon which the book is premised. We see Adela smoking a cigarette in the comfort of her San Francisco apartment. The smoke curls up into the panel above, the tea and cookies suggesting this was a long, leisurely exchange between documentarian and speaking subject. Graphic novels make possible the visual juxtaposition of different temporal registers coexisting on a single page. For this text, those shifts transport us across not only time, illustrating a then and a now, but also across genders and geographies, even as we remain within the narrative sphere of Adela's life story. Sexilio then recounts how, after being drafted and rejected by the Cuban army for being a homosexual, Adela was educated and trained as a teacher, but then later dismissed from her teaching post for wearing, quote, a little foundation, some tasteful rouge, nothing wild. Therefore, by the time a bus full of Cubans crashed into the Peruvian embassy in Havana seeking political asylum, and Castro opened the Mariel harbor to anyone who lacked revolutionary genes, Adela knew it was time to leave. Like many people who arrived at the Peruvian embassy seeking to leave Cuba's national experiment of state socialism behind, Adela was brutally attacked and physically beaten by bands of Cuban patriots to chants of que se vayan, abajo la escoria, let them leave, down with the scum. This is a scene of a nation expelling those it has already rejected, those who never really fit in. As the refuse of the Cuban nation-state, the refugees of the Mariel arrived in the United States to find themselves equally vilified by much of the Cuban-American community that received them. Darker, poorer, and queerer than previous waves of Cuban refugees, they were taunted as homosexuals, prostitutes, and criminals on both sides of the Caribbean divide, and shipped out to remote refugee camps to await resettlement. The image in the top left is Adela, having recently arrived at the improvised refugee camp in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, after suffering a brutal beating before leaving Cuba. On the prior page, having been unable to find a bed in the overcrowded barracks, Adela sits on a bench under the stars. A stranger approaches her saying, "Hey, Mama, why is that nice face so sad tonight?" In the panel we see here, the stranger informs Adela that having been in Fort Chaffee a month, he's now the barracks czar, a position that includes the benefits of a private shower. In these moments of seeing Adela in masculine drag, I meet a person I've never known. But I confess, this is an insight I came to in writing about the text, not in my initial reading of it. Literature and fantasy train us to jump back and forth into different temporal registers, to inhabit different bodies and perspectives effortlessly. On the following page, in a full-page spread, I am returned to the Adela that I know at the time of Cortés's interview, and the dialogue reflects back on her early days in the camps. I was a wreck child, tore up, beat down, dirty, hungry, tired, but after just 48 hours in the USA, I had a puppy and a private crib. All I needed was a poodle and a picket fence. I was so exhausted, I almost didn't realize he was seducing me. But then I realized, and I thought, I know this. It's beauty and sex getting me what I need. Different country, same exchange. Pussy power, baby, pussy power. If her language seems to essentialize a connection between feminist prowess and female genitalia, it is a gendered essentialism that Adela readily assigns to herself. A sexual power capable of making the American dream of a puppy and a private crib come true, even if only for one night. But her text also identifies in explicit terms the transnational, transactional value of feminine sexual labor and the material rewards of knowing how to work sex. Moreover, it suggests how the sexual labor we might perform within romantic relationships, including marriage, can also function as a kind of commodity, a service performed in exchange for social status, jewelry, or domestic harmony. Even in these non-commercial contexts, when is sex about mutual aid and shared pleasure, and when is it a transactional exchange performed across uneven registers of power? Pages later, in a chapter called Legal Tender, Adela, now established in Los Angeles with a gay Cuban sponsor, begins a more formal relationship with sex work. Makeup, drugs, clothes, hormones, food, and a million other expenses. It was hard to keep up with my salary from my sewing work. I wasn't living rent-free anymore, so Mama needed to capitalize big time. So I said, fuck it. And I went and I took hoochie pictures and I put an ad in the Ho Rag, Hollywood Connections, to see if I could get some business. In the top panel, alongside this lament, we see the actual ad Adela used to promote her sexual services. Here, the inclusion of a photographic clipping in the text performs a kind of doubling, where the subject of representation is situated in the presence of her own image. Rather than a graphic rendering, we see an actual photograph of Adela with long dark hair, crouching down in high heels and lingerie and staring directly at us, her penis hanging between her garter and stocking-covered thighs. Capitalizing on her difference, she describes herself as an exotic Cuban she-male, ouch, and lists her measurements as 34, 26, 38, and 8 inches. We might all agree that the text is cringeworthy. She-male is both cringeworthy and offensive. But she makes clear that it worked to pay the rent. And as in the episode with the goat, her readers can leave their judgments aside. And as she states in the panel below, the response was off the hook, even if the number one request was for the surprise down south. But in the bottom right panel, we also glimpse her boredom and frustration at performing the tired narrative of racialized transgender exoticism. Positioned together on a single page within the context of a graphic depiction of her life, which is the real Adela? By the next page, even as she tells us that Mama figured out a whole menu and prices for everything, ka-ching, 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 we also learn that Adela had tired of having sex be her job. I was a great fuck, but a lousy hoe. I hated it when they wanted to have dinner first. I'm not trying to date your ass, so-and-so. So awkward. As a prostitute, I had no sexual freedom. I was a product, a service, an idea, but never really a human being. Some people can live with hoeing just fine, but it was so painful for me to live like that. Sometimes I'd think, my God, I used to be a math teacher. The last line serves to remind readers of just how different her life would have been if Adela had been allowed to stay in Cuba, to simply be a math teacher wearing a little foundation and some tasteful rouge. Within the context of my own writing project, Adela's story of using sex to pay the bills reminds readers that sex work as a kind of temporary employment is actually the norm. Apart from how these stories speak to the labor of sex work, Adela's larger narrative articulates the other ways we see Latinas work sex, as it illustrates the different kinds of things for which sex can be exchanged: pleasure, safety, shelter, money. In her book, Queen for a Day, Marcia Ochoa, another queer child of Proyecto's diasporic village, writes, glamour, beauty, and femininity are technologies with specific practices that result in social legibility, intimate power, and potentially physical survival in a hostile world. Glamour allows practitioners to conjure a contingent space of being and belonging. Here, alongside Ochoa's quote, is a photograph of Adela, working sex, translating what Ochoa calls transnational economies of desire and consumption into a strapless outfit, a flowered updo, a pink and orange makeup palette, a particularly feminine gesture of registering interest and aloofness simultaneously. The year is 1991. If until now you had only glimpsed Adela through Jaime Cortez's graphic illustration, this image presents another view, one that captures a particular moment and style, 13 years before the release of Sexilio. The photograph also reveals how glamour functions as its own kind of sexual labor. This look took work. I pause here because the visual presence of Adela in living color has entered the room. And it is precisely that moment that I'm interested in marking. What does it mean to see Adela outside the narrative frame of the graphic novel that Cortés has provided? How are his drawings of her related to the image we see here or the image of her that you had already conjured? What might it mean to read her image in all of the queerest senses of that word alongside her story? Perhaps, like me, you're finding it hard to look away from those perfectly lined pink lips. Images invite us to linger, and having taken in as much as we can, the presence of an image can begin to demand more. Nowadays, when we want to probe deeper into the visual archive of someone's life, we look to Facebook, or more likely for younger generations, Instagram. And Adela's Facebook page does not disappoint. In this profile picture, the hair is blonde and short, her chosen name, Adela Cuba. Here, the designer sunglasses perform their own kind of shade. And while her feed is cluttered with the usual collection of political and personal rants and raves, Adela also maintains a photo album that she has entitled The Amazing Past, a personal visual archive of her larger-than-life history. What does biographical representation mean in a digital age when each of us can document our own lives, complete with images, stories, and silences? If the digital, with its self-authored overload of sights and sounds, doesn't necessarily get us any closer to the real, what does it instantiate? Here we see Adela strutting her stuff for the camera and her audience. This is Esta Noche, a broke-down dive queer Latino bar, the last queer Latino bar to close in San Francisco, a queer space that meant so much to so many, including Adela. But here in these photographs, we're transported to a time before gentrification and the white re-territorialization of San Francisco's Mission District. Esta Noche is open for business, packed with the possibility of action, and Adela is silently belting out a song. It could be said that her curated album on Facebook is her attempt to document her life visually, to give her memories material substance, even if that substance is digital. But while Adela may lack many things, most importantly a job at the moment, what she does not lack is documentation. Before appearing in Sexilio, she was interviewed for a public radio program on transgender women in San Francisco. She was also featured in Proyecto's promotional materials, including this image that I reproduced in my first book, Queer Latinidad. She was interviewed by the late oral historian Horacio Roque Ramirez and appeared in the 2009 documentary Diagnosing Difference about transgender women in San Francisco. Let's listen.
Say something about passing. I think passing is a word that discriminates us immensely. Not everybody can pass. And passing is something that the doctors will tell you to do. You try to pass. Well, no matter how much I pass, I will never be a biological woman. How about empowering me as the transgender woman that I am?
If up until now you have had my body inhabit her language and speak her quoted text, now you have the grain of her voice, the cadence of her accent to add to the sensory archive of Adela's biography. That was over 12 years ago, and she seems to be performing mature matron for the camera, blonde again, including lightened eyebrows, more subdued makeup, sporting transparent pink reading glasses that mark the age of anyone over 40. I can assure you, she's not that subdued in person, not really. In 2014, Adela appeared on the cover of the San Francisco Weekly, it's a free newspaper in the city, in a feature article by Juliana Delgado Lopero that developed into a bilingual book of collected oral histories of queer Latinx immigrants. The close-up photograph captures precisely the kinds of details that we might try to hide as we age. The weight of lines around the eyes, the texture of aging skin. But her hair is purple and it matches her lipstick perfectly. Fierce and fabulous, a punk puta who doesn't give a shit what you think about how she looks. When those interviews became a book, Cuéntamelo, the cover image chosen was another one of Adela's glam shots from years gone by. The arch of the eyebrow performing its own singular drama. Inside are 7 brief first-person narratives with illustrated drawings, and once again we get an illustration of Adela, this time from the artist Laura Cerro Melo. In 2015, Adela was once again the subject of an oral history for the book Queer Brown Voices, Personal Narratives of Latino, Latina, LGBT Activists. And in 2019, I had students work on Wikipedia projects to document queer of color lives, the minor figures that loom large in local queer histories. And after reading Sexilio, a student created a Wikipedia page for Adela because nothing says notable like having a Wikipedia page. If you've been keeping track, that makes at least 7 separate accounts of Adela's life. Each one a partial, problematic, rich, and imprecise attempt at biographical representation. Rather than capturing the subject's unique difference, these variegated forms of recognition enact the impossibility of representing alterity. The hardest part, certainly for academics, or perhaps the most comforting, is that even in the presence of the biographical subject, even if Adela was here with us now, representing herself, we wouldn't really know her, not completely, and maybe that's as it should be. In giving an account of oneself, Judith Butler suggests that to acknowledge one's own opacity or that of another does not transform opacity into transparency. To know the limits of acknowledgement is to experience the very limits of knowing. If we understand that social relations take place within a field of power, Caribbean theorist Edouard Glissant invites us to rethink the underlying dynamics of our encounters with alterity. Glissant is less invested in being faithfully represented than in affirming his resistance to having his difference determined. In his text, The Poetics of Relation, Glissant, like Butler decades later, deploys the idea of opacity as a way to resist the move to know, comprehend, and capture the other. Glissant writes, agree not merely to the right to difference, but carrying this further, agree also to the right to opacity. Rather than totalizing forms of knowledge production, the argumentative demands of theory, or even the persuasive potential of compelling interpretations, Glissant offers us poetics as another way to cling to the affective potentiality that our desires for representation and reparation might engender. For both Butler and Glissant, Opacity, the refusal of transparency, is precisely what might allow a fuller acknowledgement of social relations where the right to opacity becomes the necessary precondition that might make the vulnerability and heartbreak demanded of human connection possible. Opacity allows us to see the other, to register their difference, but it also stops short of ascribing a meaning to that difference. Butler writes, as we ask to know the other, or ask that the other say finally or definitively who he or she is, it will be important not to expect an answer that will ever satisfy. By not pursuing satisfaction and letting the question remain open, even enduring, we let the other live, since life might be understood as precisely that which exceeds any account we may try to give of it. In the ruins of representation, there is feeling, the sense of the corporeal that also leaves its trace in the archive. Focusing on feeling performs its own refusal of transparency. It performs a kind of knowledge production that is at ease in unknowing. It invites a lingering in ambiguity and ambivalence. As a methodological practice, feeling enacts a reckoning with the unruly practices of succumbing to memory and imagination. It asks that we open ourselves to the possibility of being transformed by our encounters with another. Each of the stories and images I have presented today is an opportunity to be touched and forever changed by the life of Adela Vasquez. Tonight, I'd like to conclude by returning to some of the photographs she shares on Facebook. Images that document her everyday glamour and style. In these images, we see Adela work, conjuring the African-American trans term that signals the vitality, the vigor, and the verve that is demanded of trans femme lives, the endless hustle to work it out. But Adela also includes a candid photo of herself working, sitting at her cluttered desk from her days as an outreach coordinator at Proyecto Contra SIDA, smiling at whoever stopped by with a camera to interrupt her workday. Adela was very good at her job and is rightfully proud of the life-changing work she did at Proyecto, recruiting other trans Latinas, many former sex workers like herself, to protect themselves against HIV, but also inviting them to form part of a community dedicated to living, to self and community empowerment. That photograph of Adela sitting at her desk within the offices of Proyecto also makes another point undeniably clear. Trans women, particularly trans women of color, need more than representation and documentation. They need jobs that provide health insurance, sick days, and vacation time, and access to an appropriate toilet. Indeed, a job like my own that offers a pension so that one can also stop working when the time comes. In the absence of these most basic forms of care, Black Brazilian transgender scholar Dora Santana describes the practices of survival and community formed within Black trans femme spaces of impossibility, a practice she calls mais viva, more alive, mais viva, quote, the strategies we as trans and Black people use not to be broken at the end of the day, end quote. But mais viva also demands más vida, more life. This year, for Transgender Day of Remembrance, it was reported that 2021 was the deadliest year for transgender people worldwide. 375 trans people were murdered. 9 out of 10 were trans women. Over half were sex workers, and the majority were racialized minorities or migrants. Yet Santana's invocation of mais viva also serves to remind us that survival is always more than protection from physical harm. It is about attending to the weight of a world intent on denying the beauty of your humanity and the psychic scars that stigma leaves behind. Adela is unemployed now. The nonprofit jobs have run dry or been taken over by a bright new crew of young queer and trans activists. Gentrification, spurred in part by tech sectors like Facebook, has made San Francisco unaffordable, and the influx of privileged whiteness has made it unlivable. Adela tried to leave. She went to Florida, but had to come back to San Francisco to an uncertain future in a city that seems to have no place for her. Perhaps for now, the place of glamour in Adela's life, the contingent space of being and belonging, is Facebook. Perhaps sex stops working, but the elsewhere of youth and the memory of sexual futures that could have been inhabits the images she keeps there, even as the strain and heartbreak of living remains out of sight. Rather than produce knowledge about the other, the archives that surround Adela Vasquez's life ask that we linger in the affective traces that stories and images leave behind. They call on us to dwell in the uncertainty of seeing, sensing, and feeling, and they call upon all of us to make mais vida, more life, possible for all of us. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you for having me be up here with you. I feel really, really inspired, and it just strikes me that there's so many layers of testimony here going on, and your work is so, as someone who writes memoir and comics, it's so inspiring for me to see somebody work in an academic tradition, but it feels like your work comes from a place of wanting to see and witness and sort of give honor to people, and I find that really inspiring. So thank you. I think I just want to hear you talk more about certain ideas.
Sure.
So and I think I'm going to start sort of in a selfish way by asking you about my particular interests as a cartoonist. And I'll also just note sort of two quotes that stood out to me. So I was really interested in when you mentioned glissant, and you said, glissant is not invested in being faithfully represented, but in affirming his resistance to having his difference determined. I really love that phrase. And I also love when you, in your own words, you said when you were reading for seeing and for feeling, you said focusing on feeling performs its own refusal of transparency, performs a kind of knowledge production that is at ease and unknowing. It invites a lingering in ambiguity and ambivalence. Okay, so these concepts of resistance and also the lingering and ambiguity and ambivalence, this is a long question, but I'm getting there. How do you feel like drawing in particular speaks to that resistance and also that desire for lingering? And I'm curious if like your sort of if your feeling about drawing has changed at all, as you've been spending more time with Sexilio. Yeah.
That's actually a really wonderful question. This chapter, the rest of the book is pretty much a photographic archive. There are a couple of documentaries that I look at, but I think there was something about closing in part with this graphic novel to really think of the creativity. I mean, drawing, because it's not exact. We know it's not exact. It already performs that slippage between whatever is out in the material world and how we process that, how we interpret that. And I loved your line about, the hand-drawn line, the intimacy of the hand-drawn line. And Jaime really talks about I know from hanging out with you just how long this process is, right? So this was a very long process. He says 700 hours. I mean, and what it means to sit with someone's words, to sit with their face, to watch them, to draw them as a child and then to draw them in this contemporary moment. And so I think the drawing itself already inserts us into the world of imagination. In a way that I think is really beautiful and powerful.
Yeah, I think in the introduction, Jaime talks about the hours of labor, and that makes me think about this sort of like these concentric circles of almost like loving sort of testimony. Like Jaime is doing this intense labor to give sort of witness to Adela's life, and then you're doing this labor to
I'm doing intense labor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, my own practice as a writer is really that. I mean, I've sat with these images, and sat with these quotes, these texts for years, and each time there's something a little different. Sometimes the feelings are different. Sometimes I see things. Oh my God! I didn't notice that in the text before, and so I think I'm also trying to model a kind of interpretive methodological practice. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll ask you one more question and then open it up, just selfishly, my own interests. So I was really interested when you talked about this line, the glamour in Adela's life, this contingent space of being and belonging is Facebook. And then this is so ironic given the sort of, what Facebook has and Facebook's sort of brothers and sisters have done to San Francisco and this space that Adela's life lives in. But I was wondering if you could talk about just this sort of, to compare and contrast the sort of archive of social media to the archive of this graphic novel. Like, what are the sort of, especially when it comes to this simultaneous temporality that the graphic novel allows, that you mentioned a little bit. The fact that we see Adela like narrating in the present moment, present moment, and then we also see the past image of Adela. And social media allows for some interesting sort of experience with time where you can jump back and, what did you call it? The amazing past, And so do you see any like sort of problems or potentials for social media specifically in representing queer life, especially trans life?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I should begin by saying that there are no photographs of Cuba. There are no photographs of Adela before transition. The fact that on Facebook you can curate your own how you see yourself, right? You get to delete the pictures where you don't look so great, right? You have this sort of control. And I'm curious about that. And in this chapter, I was interested in sort of comparing these other ways, even though there are these 7 oral histories about her, Adela still has this desire to be seen, and to be seen in particular ways, and to be seen in all of her sort of glamorous beauty. And I wanted to sort of sit with the possibility of that, of how you want to see yourself. And that is no more or less real or authentic, but it's different. It's yours. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it also changes everything that we know about when we think of biography and autobiography. I think now when we read a book, even if we're reading an academic text, there is this sort of desire to, well, what does the author look like, right? And we all have a certain amount of control about, what images appear. And so I'm curious about narrative forms like the Latin Americanists will know, like, testimonial literature, right? Like, I, Rigoberta Menchú. Well, now Rigoberta could just get on TikTok, right? Like, right? She doesn't need this foreign intermediary to tell her story. You can just live stream your story, your truth in that moment. And so I think it's really changing what we think of as being possible.
Yeah. I mean, especially you get this graphic novel, and then social media is the sort of breaking of the fourth wall. Like, you could actually just Google and find the Facebook page of Adela, and then it sort of changes almost the contract that the artist who's telling this story has made with the audience, or something like that. Okay, let's see if anyone in the room. I know there's a lot of questions here, but I feel like
you point to the
we
people.
should give priority. I can't really see, but I think that's Channing. Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, Channing.
Hi, Channing.
Juana. Wonderful presentation, Juana. And I will try to ask a question that I think nobody else will ask.
Okay.
So, at one point in your lecture, you referred to stories valued as medicine. And as I sit here as a queer person of color, listening to you talk about another queer person of color, I feel a sense of fullness, a sense of I want to breathe easier, that stories of people like me are being told and that their lives are being celebrated. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that, and why, and perhaps that's why you chose to talk about Adela today.
Yeah. And the rest of that line is like before PrEP and the medical management of AIDS. And the problem is that, it's manageable for those that can manage. And that excludes a lot of people. And so the idea that we all need stories, that art, that literature is what helps give our lives this kind of fuller meaning. And, what I loved about Proyecto was HIV, Latinx HIV organization. And the first thing that they did was they challenged the idea that everyone wanted to live. So it wasn't about teaching people how to use a condom. It was about giving people a reason to want to live. And so I think stories give us other models for how people have survived what we're maybe only enduring, right? So, thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think that's Yanni.
It is.
Yes. Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, Juana, thank you very much for the talk. And I've been watching in the 3 months that I've known you with fascination about how it is that you present yourself and how you present others.
Yeah.
And it's always in motion. It's never a fixed entity, neither yourself nor others. And that instability, I think, is a conversation, if you described tonight, about what you call opacity, which is also about freedom and possibility. I think it does come down to that, and about a human condition. And that movement, I think, is something I agree with. That we're never quite fixing, nor should we fix others. And yet we always fall back on certain stable categories. In your case, it's people of color and Latinx, and I wonder why. We all have them, and I wonder why these ones in your case. And then there's another thing, which is that it's a paradox we all face, which is that we try to give the people we look at a certain freedom to express themselves in their own context as they would see themselves. And yet we're doing this always by framing them within finite boundaries. We do it in the books we write, we do it in the pictures we show, we do it in the Facebook pages which is a frame of their frame. And here there seems to be, it would seem at first glance that we're saying, well, there's a paradox here. That we're framing, even when we're describing emotion, we're still describing. And I wonder if this is made possible by the fact that we ourselves, and you yourself in this case, as authors, are the ones with the confidence and the stability. I wonder.
You know, I think I started by sort of suggesting all the ways in which the languages we inhabit have preceded us. So I think when we use terms like Latinx or people of color or even immigrant or woman, these are not predetermined categories. I'm not saying that we know what they are or that they're fixed and stable. I'm saying these are the words that we have that that we inhabit. And, you know, we still, you know, we speak in language. Although in my last book, I talked quite a bit about gesture, so we can talk about that as well. I'm trying to think of the other part of that. I mean, I do think that as academics, we have these kind of particular investments in saying something definitive, in making a point, in arguing a position. And I'm rarely interested in that.
Yeah, Juana, your lecture was really inspiring, I think, both academically but also emotionally. And I found that quite unique. And the observation you made about representation in this particular case, I think, go in their importance much beyond the case. And my question really is, in what way do you think, if you talked about representation of any one of us in the room, would it be different from the story you told us about Adele?
I'd love to tell your story. I mean, I think the thing is that, you know, each of us have stories that circulate around us. There are the stories that your mother might tell about you or that your partner might tell you about you. And even if we assemble all of these people and they all tell their stories, there's, you know, I think of it as a kind of absence and an excess. There's still something missing, but there's also this excess. They're probably ascribing things to you that are, you know, fully yours, right? So there's always this sort of space between what's not said and what we imagine, what we project onto the people around us. And I'm really have, you know, really intrigued by, in part by the way we keep trying to tell stories. I think there's something about knowing that we're going to be misrecognized, misinterpreted, maybe that's that offers a kind of security, right? Rarely does someone like really get us, and if they get us, they got us in an instant. It doesn't necessarily mean that in the next instant they might, you know, they miss the point, right? So I'm interested in these sort of spaces of absence and excess. Yeah. I think Sabina had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Juana, for this really inspiring talk. I would like you to spend a few more words on the idea of lynching as a form of resistance, as a practice of resisting, but also maybe as a practice of writing, of engaging with the other. There's a German word, lungern, herumlungern, which is semantically pretty close and also in the sound close to lynching. And it's often used as a kind of derogatory term. If you know, herumlungern means you don't do anything. You waste your time. But I think wasting time could be a way of resistance, and I think that's something you have in mind, so I would like you to spend a few more words and ideas on the notion of lynching.
I love this idea of kind of refusing the productive, refusing, just get to the point. Just tell us what you think. That lingering sort of embodies. But I also, and I'm thinking of that in sort of all the neoliberal demands to make, to do, to produce, to define, to categorize. And lingering is sort of like slow food, you know? It marinates. And as it marinates, I mean, if we think of, I love to cook. You know, when you're cooking and something's on the stove, right? And the texture of it changes, the smells change, the consistency changes, and the longer you spend with it, the taste changes. And so I think as a kind of practice, I think there's something feminine about that. I think that this demand to produce, to define, is this kind of masculinist, like point, you know, argument. And I'm less interested in sort of making a singular defining point, and more interested in the kind of sensory experience of sitting with ideas and and opening myself to ideas, not imposing my reading, my interpretation onto a text or an image, but actually letting that image enter me, right? Fill me, right? And I think that's a feminine position that I gladly take up. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Questions?
Sam.
Okay.
Just to follow up on that, is this related to the idea of opacity versus transparency? And could you talk a little about that? Because I found that completely fascinating.
Yeah. You know, it's curious. I'm trying to think of the first artist that visited us, Julie. Yes, yeah. Right? Was also talking about opacity and the abstract and this kind of refusal of just this, a transparent access to something. I think particularly when we were looking at her images, this idea that, and I think particularly with regard to marginalized subjects, this idea that now we know. Oh, we read this book by Sam Chang, and now we know what the Chinese American experience is. Now we know. No, you don't, right? So what does it mean to sort of be okay with not knowing? Be okay with what you didn't get, right? And what it means to give, to allow, like, what is this desire? Like, when we want that kind of interiority, who do we share that with, right? And so I think that, you know, as creative people, right, of course, you want to offer, you want to create these inner worlds for your characters. But you know that the people reading them, they're going to get something. And then they're going to put all this other stuff that they brought with them to that character, to that scene. And it's again, like that, they're bringing their excess. They're bringing their own personal archive of experiences, of stories, of memories to your text, right? And they're you know, transforming it in their mind. And so I think transparency that we can see through, right? And we know what this is about is Yeah. Visibility is a trap. That's Michel Foucault, that's not me, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Juana, thank you very much. I learned a lot about sensitive approaches towards people and life stories. I wonder, since I'm an anthropologist, and I was like connecting it to what I know about sensual ethnography. And there's like, part of it is this idea that you not only describe the subjects you encounter, but also the encounter itself, like the connection you make between, and you also like reflect your own subjectivity in that encounter. And I wonder, I mean, you didn't, in your presentation, you didn't explicitly address your encounter with Adela, but, and that I started wondering, but then I realized in a way you did, because it was not only about presenting Adela, but also you presented us, yourself to us. So I just wonder, like, what do you think about encounter subjectivity and also the subjectivity of the researcher?
Yeah. The person that I'm quoting about glamour, Marcia Ochoa, is an anthropologist. And her book, Queen for a Day, is actually really quite interesting in that regard, in terms of how she engages the communities that she lives in and studies. And there are numerous points in that text where she's describing this scene, right? And she writes about femininity in Venezuela and looks at beauty pageants and drag beauty pageants. And so there's this one scene where she's, helping one of the contestants get dressed, and like everyone's like sort of half naked, and she's Marcia's this kind of butch, and she's surrounded by like all of this like kind of TNA, right? It's like all in her face, and she talks about the experience of writing about femininity as this masculine female subject, and how all of them are kind of constantly making her the center, the ways they flirt, the ways they engage. And those parts of that ethnography really were so delightful, because they give us a sense that this is a real person in the world. And it's a real person in the world that cares about the world. And I think it's that caring about the world, caring about the people, that emerges in those moments. And that's, sort of what's missing in these more kind of detached accounts that try to erase the questioner. When you read an interview, and sometimes you just see the answers and you don't hear the question, right? So what does it mean to give us the reason, right? The kind of spirit with which those questions were asked, the way that person was embedded or not in a community of belonging. So, yeah. I'll also say that, with Adela, I do know Adela. She's, we're not besties, but we're friends. But there were also moments in this book. For example, the historical archive that I started with, that 1865 Mexico City, there were like 400 images, but I found 17 Juanas, right? I found, and 2 Juana Marias, right? So I'm looking through this historical archive, right? And I'm looking for pieces of myself there. And of course, I linger on those stories just a little bit longer. I'm a little more interested in the people that share my name, right? Or when I see someone in that archive, I ran into a sex worker from Germany and another one from Cuba, right? And so it's like, oh, okay. I mean, so what are the things that pique our interest in the archive, right? So I think I'm interested in, we're fleshy human subjects. Just because we're academics doesn't mean, we don't stop being fleshy human subjects.
There are so many questions in the chat. And there's also just an outpouring of how much people love the talk, so I'll let you just pour over those later. But I guess, so I'll ask this question. It seems like your work is critical of traditional ethnography, and this is maybe a little bit connected to what you were just talking about. You are willing to get close to your subjects, do not adopt a paternalistic or objective attitude towards them. Is this intimate ethnography, or maybe you have another word for what you do?
Yeah, I'm not an ethnographer. It's curious. I'm always interested in. I write a lot about marginalized subjects, but very often they've already left a trace. Like maybe it was here, right? Like I didn't have to interview Adela. Mm-hmm. All of this information about her life already exists. Mm-hmm. It's like, what do we value as source material? How do we read an outfit? How do we read the way you throw a party? I mean, the way you throw a party says a lot about who you are. So I'm interested in those, when I was writing about Proyecto, rather than interviewing people, I looked at their flyers. I looked at their events. I looked at the kind of food that they served at their events. It was always this great multicultural spread of, so I'm reading, I value these other things as well. Yeah. So it's not so much a critique of ethnography. I think, what you're suggesting is this kind of intimate ethnography. This is not ethnography, right? These texts were already there. I just picked them up, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I will summarize. So there's multiple people asking about the legibility of your project and the dimensions of your project being in Berlin. So are there new questions that have sort of become possible for you when you think about readers who are not just in the U.S.?
Yeah.
Another question is also wondering if you're getting reticence here in Berlin of your project engaging with critical race theory, ethnic studies, and if you've had any experiences engaging with non-white racial and ethnic communities in Germany. Yeah.
Yes. I have really loved my time in Berlin. And in many ways, part of the reason why I decided to talk about Proyecto for my lecture next week was because there are a lot of things about Berlin right now and the kind of activist and art communities that are emerging that remind me of San Francisco in the 90s, before gentrification, before Facebook and Twitter kind of took things over. And what I'm seeing are a lot of really beautiful mutual aid projects, a lot of people taking care of one another. There's a wonderful organization that I've connected with called Casa Cua, which is provides really expansive ideas of health to queer and trans communities, really centering communities of color without necessarily having very rigid ideas about what that means. And I'll just give you like a sense of the kind of thing that they do. You know, I don't know, there are some feminine subjects here. You know, getting rid of like hair is a thing. And so they purchased a laser device so that all the trans women could have access to this technology that actually costs a lot of money. So rather than thinking of that as this individual thing, well, here's this thing that we can all share. They do clothing exchanges. So how are people taking care of each other in really interesting, creative ways? And, you know, I remember when activism wasn't a job, right? When it was just something that you did. That, you know, I remember I was working as a temp and just like Xeroxing flyers off of the company machine, right? So like, I think that there's a lot of that energy. I see a lot of that energy in Berlin. I think that people here are anxious about what it means to define something as like critical race theory. And there is this desire to, like, that's not us, right? And Germany has its own issues, right? But I think what critical race theory does, what ethnic studies does, is it really, you know, forces us to think in these really kind of complex ways about all the ways that race, ethnicity, culture, how we look, how we speak, right? I think it's curious. I wanted you to hear Adela's accent, right? How does having an accent mark us in particular ways, right? I remember when I was I lived in Spain for a year. And every time I opened my mouth to speak Spanish, you know, sudaca, right? I was like, in some ways, more racially marked than I would be in the United States. And so I think how we embody these things, right? They're not these singular, static, knowable categories. They're ideas, they're processes, how race is socially constructed, right? It's a process. Racialization is a process. It's not a fixed, knowable identity that we enter into. It's historical, it's cultural, it's contextual. And so I think there's, and the fact that it is so threatening to the United States right now tells you just how vital and how important a dialogue it is. Because I think so many of these questions, you know, aren't really surfaced without a willingness to engage that kind of complexity in all of its dimensions. Yeah.
One more question from the Zoom. It's okay? One more. Okay. So just remind the Zoom viewers that I actually am forbidden from German privacy laws from revealing who you are. So just tell people that. But somebody is basically asking, what advice could you offer to someone who's trying to get at, in their case, the queerness of an important Black German figure in which the evidence is fragmentary? And you might segue that into sort of advice for young scholars generally.
You know, the other theorist that I'm very much indebted to for this project has been Sadia Hartman and her beautiful text, Wayward Lives, and also she has another text, Venus in Two Acts, where she offers, she's looking at the archive of African American enslavement, and she calls it critical fabulation. The process of imagining more than what's there. For Hartman, you know, when you encounter these archives that can sometimes be like so painful, almost soul crushing. I mean, the archive of slavery is it's a soul crushing archive. What does it mean to imagine the ways that joy might also, I want the women that I profile, I want to know that they experience joy. That even in lives surrounded by, misogyny and stigma, that there are these other potential for friendship, for cariño, for care, for community, and for joy. And so I think sometimes you have to read into what you want. I think for this person, clearly they're bringing their own desires to this biography, right? And so what would it mean to just be open about their desires? Maybe how important it is for them to encounter this Afro-German person in the archive, and that, tell us about your desire for their life, what you wish you knew. Because I'm interested in reading that as well.
That's great. Thank you, Juana. That'd be great. Thank you.